Good evening, AP World students. Today I am going to be telling you about Trans-Oceanic European empires, uh, kind of combining a few topics from AP World, topics 4.3 Columbian Exchange, 4.4 Empires, and 4.4 and 5. You'll see what I mean when we get to it, but it's cramming a lot of information, giving you a big overview of it all. So, from 4.1 and 4.2, you heard about how Europeans are learning about a lot of different navigational techniques from their increased contact with Africa and the Middle East and Asia. This leads them to want to start exploring the world with that new navigation techniques, mainly because they want to get more connected to world trade and they don't want to have to do it by traveling along the Silk Road through the Ottoman Empire. So, improved techniques lead them to start having schools, especially known for this is the Portuguese, with a prince of Portugal named Henry, who creates a navigation school and he starts training explorers. But other European countries, especially in Western Europe, in England and France, the Netherlands, and Spain, also start training explorers as well. But the Portuguese are first, and they begin traveling around the west coast of Africa down all the way to the south to try to figure out if they can get around Africa and get to uh, Indian Ocean trade and China by water instead of going over land, instead of having to deal with Italian traders or the Ottoman Empire, because it would be a lot cheaper because they won't have to pay taxes. And you can also fit a lot of more goods on boats than on carts that would be going across the Silk Road. As they are going, they start setting up these trading posts along the coast of Africa and then eventually in islands and along the coast of the Indian Ocean. And they do this and they start monopolizing the trade of spices and other Asian goods like silk and also African goods as well, and eventually slaves as well from Africa. So the Portuguese start to take over all of Indian Ocean trade because of their improved boats, and it's a big shift in the area. However, Indian Ocean trade pretty much stays the same, except instead of having, originally it was Indian traders that were controlling Indian Ocean trade, then Muslim traders or Arab traders controlling Indian Ocean trade, and now it's just Portuguese, so people from Europe. But other Europeans are going to start coming in as well. Some major changes that happen from this trade, though, are some Asian countries like China and Japan start restricting trade with foreigners because they are afraid of European influence coming into their country. They're used to, especially China, they're used to just being able to do whatever they want, and these Europeans that are coming into their country are not exactly following their customs and might trying to be influencing them in other ways, like spreading Christianity. So eventually, the Ming Dynasty and China and Japan decide to restrict trade and only allow it for certain parts of the year. In Africa, major trade is going to be the shift away from trans-Saharan trade, going north across the Sahara, to trade along the coast. So we have different groups of people, different kingdoms, especially ones like the Ashanti in West Africa and the Congo in Central Africa, becoming more powerful because they are able to trade with the Portuguese and others along the coast, whereas the Songhai or the Mali on the trans-Saharan trade have some power still, but are starting to lose some of their power. The Spanish are a little bit behind the Portuguese and are looking for an advantage. So when a man named Christopher Columbus, hopefully you've heard of him, comes to the Spanish, he's Italian, but he comes to the Spanish king and queen because nobody else will listen to him. And he says he thinks he can go west to get to Asia instead of going around Africa. They relent and are able to fund him with 3 ships. It's not a big deal, but they're like, it's worth a shot just in case, because if they can get to China quicker and not have to compete with the Portuguese, that would be huge for the Spanish. Side note about Columbus: He was not the first person to realize the Earth was round. In fact, people knew that the Earth was round for 1,000 years before him. All the Spanish knew that the Earth was round. What he thought was actually inaccurate was that the Earth was a lot smaller than it was, and everybody knew how big the Earth was. That scientists had actually figured out the size of the planet, and what they thought was that there was no land where the Americas are. It was all just one big gigantic ocean, and you'd never be able to cross it because it was so big. But he was like, no, it's a lot smaller than you think, and I'm going to prove it. So he didn't prove it, but he did discover, in quotes, the Americas, although there were millions and millions of people, at least probably around 100 million people there. But what his discovery, in quotes, did was it made the Eastern Hemisphere aware that there were people and land in the Western Hemisphere that they did not know about. The Spanish take advantage of this, and they, after a couple decades, are prepared and send conquistadors or conquerors with armies, really small armies, but armies to take over some of the empires of the Americas. Hernan Cortez goes to the Aztec Empire, the Triple Alliance in Mexico in 1521, and he is able to conquer the Aztec Empire, which is one of the biggest empires in the world at the time, with only 600 men. How is this able to be done? So he's got a few things on his side. He had really good timing, because remember we talked about the Aztec Empire. Nobody really likes them. They're a brutal empire. They take over all the people around them. They are taking people from all the different city states as slaves and as human sacrifices. So when the Spanish get there, they're able to convince all the different city states around the Aztec Empire to fight against the Aztec with the Spanish. So even though it's only 600 soldiers, they get thousands of Amerindians to fight with them. They also have disease on their side. It's been a couple decades since Europeans have started to travel over. And unfortunately for American Indians, they do not have an immunity towards many of the East Asian or Eastern Hemisphere diseases like smallpox. So many of the Aztec have already died from diseases. Then you also have better weapons and better armor and better horses. The Spanish have metal armor and they have iron. The Aztecs do not have iron. They have maybe some bronze, but most of their weapons are like wood with stones in it and things like that. So you having steel swords and steel armor, and then on top of it being on horses, that's a huge advantage in fighting. It's actually not the guns that a lot of people think would be the advantage that the Spanish have, because the guns at the time are not very accurate and take a long time to reload. But it is the much better steel and horses, because there are no animals in the Americas at the time that people can ride. So when you have somebody that can go 4 or 5 times faster than the other people and hit them with that much force as well, because when you're going faster, you're hit with more force. So that is how they are able to take over the Aztec Empire in Central America. A decade later, they then send another conquistador to the Inca Empire, which was even larger than the Aztec Empire. And his name is Pizarro. How is he? And they send him with less soldiers. They send him with about 400 soldiers. So how is Pizarro able to conquer the Inca Empire? Again, he's got lucky timing, or maybe they knew that this was going on at the time. The emperor of the Inca emperor actually dies from smallpox, and his two sons, Atahualpa is one of them, and the other one, and his brother, are fighting over who will be the next emperor, and they are fighting a brutal civil war. And by the time the Spanish get there, by the time Pizarro gets there, they've already been fighting this war for a long time, and the country is really in bad shape. So when Pizarro gets there, Atahualpa sees them and says, "Oh, maybe these guys will work with me and help me out to kill my brother and take control." So when Pizarro gets there, Atahualpa actually welcomes him and has him come meet with him in a clearing. And instead of negotiating to help out Atahualpa in this civil war, Pizarro instead massacres Atahualpa and his people who came without weapons And he also, and it's just so shocking to the Inca people because they see Atahualpa as a god, and all of the Inca emperors are seen as gods. Um, so unlike with the Mexica in and the Aztec Empire, most people didn't like the Aztec emperor. In the Inca Empire, many of the people did like the Inca emperor, and they actually start rebelling against Pizarro. He is eventually able to put down the rebellion, though, and take control of the Inca Empire. So, with these two conquests, you have the two major empires in the Americas taken over by the Spanish. They're able to get a whole lot of land. They're able to convert a whole lot of people to Christianity, and they start searching for gold and other precious metals that they might be able to get from the Americas. So by the end of the 16th century, by the end of the 1500s, they have one of the biggest empires in the world. The Portuguese also do get a little land in the Americas. They're a little late to it, though, but they get a little part of land on the East Coast, which would be later known as Brazil. But they are much more focused on Africa and Asia. And because they are both Catholic countries, and as we talked about already in last unit, the Catholic Church is trying not to lose any more Catholics. So they don't want two major Catholic countries fighting each other. So the Pope helps sign a treaty between the Portuguese and the Spanish to try to prevent them from fighting over land in the Americas, and it's called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And the basic idea is the Portuguese can keep on doing what they're doing with their trading post empires in Africa and Asia, and the Spanish can keep on doing what they're doing in most of the Americas. The Spanish then set up two major centers of authority, basically two big little countries, one in Mexico and one in what's modern day Peru. They make the capital of the New Mexico, where the old capital was near Tenochtitlan. And in Peru, it didn't really make sense for them to have the capital where the old capital of the Inca Empire was, because that was Machu Picchu. It was up in the mountains, and that's not really what they're focused on. They're focused on sea travel, so they make a new capital along the coast in Lima. Here's the map of the Treaty of Tordesillas, and you can basically see they just took a map of the world. They didn't have a very complete map of the world when this was made. It was made in 1494, just 2 years after Columbus. So they didn't have a complete map, but what they decided was anything in between these two lines, so east of the Treaty of Tordesillas, west of the Treaty of Zaragoza, that is where the Portuguese can trade, and anything on the other side is where the Spanish can trade. It's basically if you have a sibling that you have to share a room with and you've ever put tape along the floor and said, this side is mine, that side is yours, and you're not allowed to cross over. That's basically what the Pope did with the Spanish and the Portuguese. The Spanish in the Americas took advantage of the local population because so they're taking instead of what the Portuguese were doing in the Africa and Asia was putting up these little cities basically along the way. Spanish decide that they are going to take over the entire territory. And they don't have enough people to farm that entire territory or work on that entire territory. So they do what all greedy empires are doing, and they decide to enslave the people. But they do it, and they convince the people that they're just using the old system of how the old empire worked in the Inca Empire. In the former Aztec Empire, it doesn't exactly work like that. They institute something called the encomienda system, which was a way to encourage Spanish people to move to the Americas. And they said, anybody that moves to the Americas, we will let you take over this piece of land. You just pay taxes to the Spanish crown. And in return, you get to demand tribute from the people that live there and force the people to be slaves to you, basically. So they just took this big portion of land and said, anybody that wants to move over, you get the land and you get the slave and all the people on it as slaves. In the Inca Empire, the Inca had a system already in place for public works. It was basically like the way that the people paid taxes. So you had the people for a couple months out of the year had to do some kind of public works project, either building the palace or building the roads or giving up some of their farm product to the government. The Spanish people hear about this and decide, we're going to keep on doing the Mitja system, except now it's 12 months out of the year that you have to work for the Spanish. And they really take advantage of the system. In as far as social changes that happen in Latin America from the Spanish, they start to create what could be considered the first real structure, systematic structure of um, racial superiority. And throughout all of history, yes, there have been people of different skin color and people of different backgrounds and places of origin, but race has never really been a concept until the Spanish take over the Americas. And here they decide that skin color makes you a different race, and that lighter skin color makes you a better race. So they institute a new social hierarchy, and they do this because, again, they have Spanish people coming over mixing with Native American people, and it's mostly just men coming over, not with families. And so, because of that, many of the men come over and begin to either take wives or mistresses or force themselves on Native people. And there starts to be many people who are of mixed descent, Spanish and Native American. And then eventually, when they start taking over African slaves, same thing happens where you now have a mix of three different cultures: African, Spanish, and Native American. So, in order to try to keep control and make sure that the Spanish are still in charge, they come up with this social hierarchy. And it's basically the lighter skin you are, the more rights you have. At the top, you have the Peninsulares. These are people who are born on the Iberian Peninsula. That's why it's called the Peninsulares. So they're from Spain or Portugal. Then you have underneath them Creoles, which are people who are 100% European, but born in the Americas. And they just do that because they don't know if they can trust them as much as people born in Spain. Underneath that, you have people of mixed descent. So that's people who are some Spanish and some Native American. They've called them mestizos. And then part Spanish or European and part African is a derogatory term called mulatto. That word is derogatory because it basically comes from the word mule. And as there are more and more mixings of different percentages of people from Europe, Africa, and Asia and America, they come up with more and more different terms for different groups of people. And oftentimes, the names that they come up for these groups of people are dehumanizing, like calling them mule or lobo for wolf, etc. Right? So they come up with these dehumanizing terms to show that they are less than the Europeans. The society is also very patriarchal. And this comes from Spain. The father has authority over his wife and children. Women couldn't hold political positions. They couldn't run plantations or mines. And they sometimes would have full rights to inheritance, but not often. And so a lot of time, in a lot of places, this is even less patriarchal than Native Americans had there. Uh, Aside from the Spanish and Portuguese, the British come in a little bit later. So because of that, they don't get as some of the good places in the Americas you would think, right? So they get mostly in the east coast of North America, where the 13 American British colonies were, and in some parts of Canada. The first really successful ones in the East Coast of America were all formed as joint stock companies. What those are is a bunch of rich people in England, instead of the British government just funding it, a bunch of rich individuals in England pool all their resources together and buy a ship and a crew and go and try to settle a colony. So those first few successful ones, Jamestown, the Pilgrims in Massachusetts, the Puritans, the Quakers in Pennsylvania, and the Catholics in Maryland, are all formed by joint stock companies, a bunch of rich people putting their money together and bringing over an expedition to try to start a colony. And those are all successful. First one in Roanoke was not successful, and a lot of the people either died or became part of some Native American tribes. Joint stock companies would make a profit, and any of the profit goes back to those people who invested money in it. Later on, the British also then take some Dutch territory that's in the middle that was New Netherlands. It becomes New York. And eventually they have the whole East Coast except for Florida, which they then later take from Spain. The French are even less successful. They get some parts of Canada and some parts of the Louisiana, but they really don't settle it very much, especially in Louisiana. They don't send too many people through that whole territory that they own. In Canada, they do send people, but it's mostly to try and trade with Native Americans for fur, because the fur market has really gone up during this time period. Their colonies grow slowly because it's really cold up there and it's not a lot of good farmland. So it's really just traders. They don't send whole families there, whereas the British are sending whole families to try to populate the eastern shore. So to contrast the Spanish or Latin America with North America, in Latin America, you have the encomienda admitis and slave labor. In North America, you have slavery, but you also have indentured servitude. A lot of British come over as indentured servants and work off their time as basically slaves for about 7 years, and then they become free. In Latin America, it's mostly single men, so they marry Native women, whereas in North America, most of the people that come over are families. So therefore, there's less intermarriage with Native Americans or with African slaves, not until later. You have the Latin America is an authoritarian government. It is run by the Spanish government. Whereas in North America, each of those colonies is its own little company. So it's run each individually. And that's why we eventually have the United States of America formed as it is, because it started as these little individual states, whereas all of Latin America was at one point one country underneath the Spanish crown. In Latin America, Amerindians are forced into labor, whereas in North America, some are used as slaves, but most are either killed or forced to move. And in Latin America, you have that hierarchical social structure where it's all based on race, whereas in North America, there's less of that. It's really just white people from Europe and then eventually African slaves underneath that. So here's a map of the two places. You could see that in around 1700, a lot of the territory in Western Hemisphere had been taken over, but really by 1780, almost the entire two continents had been taken over by Europeans. This leads us to probably one of the most important topics in the whole course, and it's probably one of the most important events in all of human history. And I'm not saying that lightly. It really is one of the most important events in all of human history. It's called the Columbian Exchange. It is named after Christopher Columbus. It's not because of anything special he did. It is something that happened as a result of his mistake. So if you look at that map, you could see that it very nicely separates Western Hemisphere and Eastern Hemisphere. Those two parts had no contact for about 20,000 years. For about 20,000 years, the people on one side and the other side didn't even know the other side existed. And they developed completely differently. They spoke different languages. They had different religions. They built buildings differently. Everything had happened separately and differently. And when Christopher Columbus made that mistake and went west and figured out that there was these two continents there that nobody really knew about except for the Vikings, what happened 500 years beforehand, and wasn't really a sustained contact between the two. When they start having this sustained contact back and forth, some major changes happen starting in the 1500s. And it happens all around the world. It's not just something that happens to the Western Hemisphere. It's not something that just happens in Europe. It is impacts all parts of the world. Some of the biological changes that happen, plants around the entire world are changed. Food, animals, and human beings and diseases are spread all around the world, and all of those things change because of it. Manufactured goods are spread around the world, and then other non-biological raw materials are spread around the world. Um, some people call this an exchange, the Columbian exchange. Other people would call it a Columbian exploitation because it's Europeans basically exploiting the world's resources, including people. Um, but these exchanges combined to establish a new global network. It's the first time that we have a real connected world and communication and trade going across the entire globe. And this is the first time that it's happened in world history. I can't understate how big of a change this was in history. One of the major things is a global diffusion of crops, meaning that plants from one side of the world get spread everywhere. And the crops really had developed differently in both sides. There was plenty of fruits and vegetables and other plants on one side that people on the other side had never seen before. Uh, Human beings are traveling from one place to another. And this is not just Europeans traveling over, it's not just African slaves who are being forced to move over, but you have Asian people coming to the Americas, Chinese and Indian and Japanese coming to the Americas. You have people from all over the world spreading all over the world. Animals being brought over. As I mentioned before, there had never been an animal that you could ride in the Americas. The biggest animals that were domesticated in the Americas were llamas and alpacas. So bringing over horses and pigs and cows and chickens, none of those had been in the Americas. One of the reasons we eat turkey on Thanksgiving is because that was the native bird that you could eat in North America like a chicken, right? There was no chicken. Um, One of the biggest, though, is going to be diseases. When you separate people for 20,000 years, uh, some develop immunity to certain diseases and some do not. Um, and when these worlds are brought together, there's going to be huge changes in the natural environment and the health and demographic patterns, meaning how people live, where they live, etc. One of the worst parts about the Columbian Exchange is what some people call the Great Dying. Um, in the New World, in the Americas, they did not have immunities to many of the diseases that people had in the Eastern Hemisphere. Smallpox is the most deadly, but there's others as well, chickenpox and other diseases. Um, this led to possibly the population dropping 80 million to 10 million over 100 years. So about 90% of the people in the Americas died in 100 years. And it wasn't from the Spanish conquering them and killing them. It wasn't from the British killing people. Most of the people who died in the Americas died from diseases, and it happened very quickly. Um, and it's kind of baffling and hard to even imagine how that many people dying, but that's what happened. And that is also one of the reasons why the Spanish and the British and the French and Portuguese are able to take over these places, not because of superior weapons and not because of superior intellect or technology. One of the main reasons they're able to take the Americas over is because so many Americans died. Um, Europeans did die as well because when they went to tropical regions like the Caribbean, they were starting to contract diseases like malaria from mosquitoes, and Europeans did not have a good resistance to malaria. One of the reasons that Europeans turned to African slaves instead of European serfs or European indentured servants is because Africans also live in a tropical region with malaria, and a lot of them had built up resistance to malaria. This is also similar in other parts of the world. When the Russians take over Siberia And when the British take over parts of Oceania, like Australia, uh, a lot of people also die from diseases that they had never had contact to. However, even with that huge amount of people dying in the Americas, world population increased. And this happens because the food products that the Europeans are able to exploit from the Americas after they take them over and after so many Native Americans die, the food that they are able to get from the Americas are in some cases way more caloric and way more nutritious than the products they had in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and easier to grow. Specifically, things like potatoes and corn. Potatoes and sweet potatoes, these are all from the Andes, from Peru. Uh, Europeans had never seen these kinds of products before, had never seen this kind of vegetables. And they're easy to grow, potatoes, and they have a lot of nutrition in them. These potatoes are spread around the world, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and they replace complete diets in all of these places. Most of the diets that you see nowadays would not exist before the Columbian Exchange. The foods there were just not there. Also, livestock is going to alter the environment. Cattle, pigs, horse, and sheep come over to the Americas and completely change the environment as well because they are eating the grass, they are excreting their manure. It's going to destroy natural vegetation. Um, and horses also changed the Americas because beforehand, the fastest mode of transportation in the Americas was walking. So the ability for Native Americans that do not die to use horses and to travel along much faster is also huge for the local population. So when you think of stereotypical Native American on a horse, uh, going after bison, that didn't exist before the Columbian Exchange because they didn't have horses. Here's the last slide that you can see some of the major things that are being transferred back and forth. Mostly from the Americas, it's really great fruits and vegetables. And from the Eastern Hemisphere, unfortunately, the major one that you want to know about is diseases. But there are some fruits and vegetables and grains and livestock that are going over to the Americas. Again, this change is the biggest change in human history, maybe. And it completely changes vegetation around the world. It completely changes people around the world. The impact, even though this started about 500 years ago, is still being felt in overpopulation in the world. There's overpopulation in the world because we can eat things like potatoes and corn everywhere. And also, you might want to be able, I haven't done research on it, but you could probably see the beginnings of global warming and climate change here because of the huge change in plants and animals, plants destroying other plants, some plants going extinct, and way more animals going extinct in this time period than had happened in previous times. So huge change, definitely one that you need to know about. All right. I hope you understood all that and have a good day.